All right, let's see. Last time we were together was a couple of weeks ago. Um, I did flirt around with trying to do Wednesday night Bible study from the hospital room with my mother, but it was the smallest hospital room she had. And so I was balancing my computer on my lap, and I don't think it would have been conducted with all the nurses and stuff coming in. So thank you for your understanding in all of that. But I do know that last time we were together, we talked about David and Goliath. And now David is a big famous man in Israel. Everybody knows who he is. He has saved Israel from the wrath of the Philistines, especially the wrath of the giant who had tested the nation of Israel for how many days? Does anybody remember?
40.
Thank you, Cheryl. Very good. Who?
40.
40 days. And so what does 40 signify in the scripture? You can't answer anymore, Cheryl. You're the teacher's pet.
It feels like cheating because I hear her. Testing or judgment?
Testing or judgment? Yes. So you would think that during this time of testing, the nation of Israel would have remembered and recalled the other times of testing that the children of Israel have been through. 40 days wandering in the wilderness. Moses was up on the mountain for 40 days, and so on and so forth. However, they forgot about it, and along comes David, the shepherd boy, who is a forerunner and a shadow of the ultimate shepherd who will come and save his nation, his people, from a far greater enemy than the Philistines. But David is now somebody in the nation of Israel. And so you would think that everything is going to be hunky-dory from then on, right? He is brought into Saul's household, and he is famous in the land, and everybody knows him, and you would think everything is going to go good for David. But beginning in chapter 18 and then all the way through the end of 1 Samuel, which ends with the death of King Saul, we see that David has been sent into the wilderness. And so often in God's planning, in God's timing, when God deals with his selected people, we see that they go through a time of exile, a time of testing, a time of being forgotten or seemingly being forgotten, but it is in essence God's training ground. We can look back at the story of Joseph. Anybody recall the story of Joseph and what happened to Joseph? Joseph was his father's favorite, and Joseph's father sends him Israel. Jacob, also named Israel, sends Joseph to check on his brothers. His brothers are jealous, and they throw Joseph in a pit and lie to the father and sell him into slavery. And they lie to the father that Joseph was killed by wild beasts, when in reality Joseph was sold into slavery, and he spends many years in slavery in Egypt. And he does well, but then we have the story of Potiphar's wife, and ultimately Joseph is thrown in prison. So the one that God has chosen to save his nation has been thrown in prison with Joseph. And so we see that it takes Joseph a long time before he realizes before he realizes the destiny that God has for him. Same thing with Moses. We see Moses gets impatient, decides to take matters into his own hands, and is therefore exiled in the backside of the desert for 40 years. God leaves Moses in the desert for 40 years as a shepherd while he is in training to go back to Egypt and lead the nation of Israel out of captivity and lead them as their first great leader. Well, we just see the same thing in David's life. Now, David's exile lasts about 13 years or so. But how many of you have ever wondered why David is called a man after God's own heart? Anybody? David, in chapter 18, we see that Saul gets jealous of David. Saul betrays David. If if you remember, one of the things that was going to happen to the one who could defeat Goliath was Saul was going to give his daughter in marriage. Correct? But when David does it and Saul gets jealous of David, Saul refuses to give his daughter in marriage to David. And so he betrays his promise. He goes back on his promise, and he gets angry at David because David has, well, let's read a little bit in chapter 18. And verse 1 of chapter 18, as soon as he had finished speaking to Saul, this is David, if you'll recall. Chapter 17 was David and Goliath, and David prevails over Goliath, and he comes back and he talks to Saul. And verse 58 of chapter 17, and Saul said to him, whose son are you? Young man. And David answered, I am the son of your servant Jesse the Bethlehemite. And as soon, chapter 18, as soon as he had finished speaking to Saul, the soul of Jonathan was knit to the soul of David, and Jonathan loved him as his own soul. Jonathan is the crown prince. Jonathan is the eldest son of King Saul. And so he has, at this moment, surrendered himself, as we're going to see in verse 4. He has abdicated the throne in favor of David. And Saul took him that day and would not let him return to his father's house. Then Jonathan made a covenant with David because he loved him as his own soul. And Jonathan stripped himself of the robe that was on him. And if you'll recall, way back in the story of Joseph, the robes had a special meaning. So Jonathan, as the crown prince, takes off his robe and gives it to David, and his armor, and even his sword, and his bow, and his belt. All of this is signifying that Jonathan is abdicating the throne in favor of David. So somehow Jonathan has understood that David has been anointed by God as the successor to King Saul, and Jonathan, rather than fighting for his own place and position, recognizes that David is the true shepherd who will lead the nation of Israel. He sees that in his behavior there in chapter 17, where he fights Goliath, not in his own strength, but in the strength of God. But anyhow, Jonathan has abdicated his throne, which is another strike against David in Saul's mind, because Saul wants to set up a dynasty. And that requires that his son succeed to the throne. And here Jonathan has already said, no, David is the one who is going to succeed to the throne of Israel, and Jonathan is going to support him in that. So Saul gets jealous. Verse 6, as they were coming home, when David returned from striking down the Philistine, the women came out of all the cities of Israel singing and dancing to meet King Saul with tambourines, with songs of joy, and with musical instruments. And the women sang to one another as they celebrated, Saul has struck down his thousands, and David his 10,000s. Now, at this point in his life, David has only struck down Goliath. But they are already elevating in the national mind, in the mind of the nation of Israel. They have already elevated David above Saul. Saul has been their king for many, many years. He has won many, many battles. And yet, here's this little upstart young man who has defeated the Goliath, and the nation of Israel is already attributing David's victory over tens of thousands, over his 10,000s, while Saul, they're attributing only his thousands. And in verse 8, and Saul was very angry, and this saying displeased him. He said, they have subscribed to David 10,000s, and to me they have subscribed thousands, and what more can he have but the kingdom? And Saul eyed David from that day on. In other words, he kept his eye on him. He was not happy with David, and he understands the nation of Israel would gladly elevate David to the throne, because they were ascribing to David at this point acts that he had not yet accomplished. He would accomplish them, but they had already recognized in David someone who was going to be a much better king than King Saul. So, then we go on, chapter 18 here. Saul had a spear in his hand, and Saul hurled the spear, for he thought, I will pin David to the wall. This is while David is playing the lyre again. David is back playing to try to calm Saul's mind, but Saul keeps throwing spears and stuff at him. Saul begins to try to kill David at this point. And bottom line is, Saul has not giving David the reward that he was supposed to be. He was supposed to get Merab, Saul's daughter, and she was the one who was supposed to, his oldest daughter, she was supposed to be the one who was given to David. That would have elevated him in the king's household, but Saul gave her to someone else. And so David ends up, after a time, with Michal, his younger daughter, and so David is married and becomes a son-in-law of Saul, but Saul is still not happy with him. And the bride price in chapter 18, the bride price is, Saul says, I want 100 Philistine foreskins. And he says, I think that David, in trying to fulfill the bride price by killing 100, because you're not going to get the foreskins willingly. You're going to have to kill the person who owns the foreskin. So he said, you bring me 100 foreskins and you can marry my daughter. So instead of bringing him 100 foreskins, David brings him 200 foreskins. And Saul all the time expected the Philistines to kill David as he was trying to fulfill that, but David succeeds because God was with him. And then at the end of chapter 18, David is made a commander in Saul's army, and he has more success than all the servants of Saul. And says so that his name was highly esteemed. His name was highly esteemed in the nation of Israel. So now we have this dynamic where Saul has already been told by Samuel that he has forfeited the kingdom. If you'll recall, when Saul was impatient and went ahead and sacrificed without Samuel, and then when Saul disobeyed God and his destruction of the Amalekites, that he was supposed to utterly destroy them, man, woman, child, ox, and goat, and donkey, and everything. Every animal, every person was to be sacrificed, or was to be slaughtered, and yet Saul kept some of the best for himself, and he left the king alive. And Samuel tells him that because you have disobeyed God, God has rejected the kingdom from you. And he has raised up, as Saul is now discovering, he has raised up a replacement. And it's not Jonathan, it's not of his household, it is David. And Saul begins to persecute David. He sends messengers to David's house to watch him, to kill him, and Michal, his wife, helps him escape, which makes her daddy mad, and so on. And then we have the story of Jonathan warning David about Saul trying to kill him, and all of those things. But if you want to understand why David is a man after God's own heart, let's turn over to Psalm 63. Now, if you're familiar with the Psalms, which simply means songs, these are songs that have been written, and David wrote a good portion of them. But if you'll look at the Psalms, at the beginning of the Psalm, there's like a prescript or postscript. It says, a Psalm of David when he was in the wilderness of Judah. This is a psalm that David wrote when he had to flee into the wilderness from Saul. David, if you'll recall, David has been anointed by God through the prophet Samuel. He has been used by God to rescue the nation of Israel. He has got all of this fame. He has done all of these things, and Saul continually tries to kill him to the point where David finally has to flee, and David is left in the wilderness, left to his own devices, left to survive as best he could for 13 years. And yet these are the type of songs that he writes during those periods. Because let's face it, you and I would probably be complaining. At least I would, right? Why, God, if you've anointed me king, what's the holdup? Why don't we get rid of Saul and let's make me king? But we see, and you go through the remainder of the book of 1 Samuel, we see that there are twice that David has Saul within his clutches. In other words, Saul goes into a cave to use the restroom, and he's alone, and David and his men are in the back of the cave, and David sneaks up and cuts a corner of Saul's garment off where he could have killed him, but he refused to because, as he himself says, he refuses to touch God's anointed, because at one point Saul was anointed by God. So David is not going to raise his hand against Saul. He's going to allow God to take care of Saul in God's timing. And another time, David and a servant sneak in to Saul's camp and take Saul's spear and his water jug to show Saul that David has no intent towards Saul. Again, David could have killed him and solved his problems, but he instead decided to trust God with his problems, which is number one, thing number one that causes David to be a man after God's own heart, because David is not going to take into his own human hands God's prerogative. It is God's prerogative. He raised up Saul. It is God's prerogative to take Saul down. And so David is content to allow God to do that, and David is not going to step in and accomplish what God is going to accomplish for him. And so in Psalm 63, it's a psalm of David when he was in the wilderness of Judah. O God, you are my God. Earnestly I seek you. My soul thirsts for you. My flesh faints for you, as in a dry and weary land where there is no water. So I have looked upon you in the sanctuary, beholding your power and glory. Because your steadfast love is better than life, my lips will praise you. So I will bless you as long as I live. In your name I will lift up my hands. My soul will be satisfied as with fat and rich food, and my mouth will praise you with joyful lips. When I remember you upon my bed, and meditate on you in the watches of the night, for you have been my help, and in the shadow of your wings I will sing for joy. My soul clings to you. Your right hand upholds me. But those who seek to destroy my life shall go down into the depths of the earth. They shall be given over to the power of the sword. They shall be a portion for jackals, but the king shall rejoice in God. All who swear by him shall exult, for the mouths of liars will be stopped. Do you see David's attitude when he is running for his life? He has Saul and the armies of Israel actively trying to seek him to kill him, and yet his trust is in God, and more than that, he is still praising God, and he is declaring that he will praise God, that he trusts in God, that, look very closely, he's hungry, he's thirsty, as in verse 1, my flesh faints for you as in a dry and weary land where there is no water. That's exactly where he's at. And so I have looked upon you in the sanctuary, beholding your power and glory, because your steadfast love is better than life, and my lips will praise you. Down in verse 5, my soul will be satisfied as with fat and rich food. My mouth will praise you with joyful lips. In other words, David is saying, I have nothing. I have no water. I have no food. I have nothing. My life is barely still here with me. And yet, in the midst of that, just praising you, contemplating you, serving you, thinking about you, all of that is better than my life. All of that is better than the best of foods and the coolest of water. So that is why David, and if you want to read some others, Psalm 34, Psalm 54, Psalm 57, 56, 59, all of those are psalms that David writes in this period in his life, and there are others, but those are psalms that David writes in this period of his life when he is seemingly abandoned by God. He is certainly abandoned by the nation of Israel. We have an instance in the balance of 1 Samuel that David saves an Israelite city from invaders, and yet they, even though David has saved them, they decide to turn him over to Saul and tell Saul where he's at. Remember, Saul is still seeking David, but David has taken his few followers and saved them, but yet they betray David. In other words, the whole nation seemingly has turned their back against David. Certainly Saul and the armies of Israel are seeking to kill him. He ends up trying to go to the Philistines, and they are going to do something, so David has to pretend to be an imbecile. He has to pretend to be a crazy person, so they will run him off and not kill him. And there's just story after story where David eventually ends up having to serve a Philistine king as a mercenary because he has been utterly abandoned by God's people. And yet, throughout the entirety of David's sojourn in the wilderness, the entirety of his time in God's university, if you will, he never ceases to seek God. He never ceases to praise God. Even he falls into sin during this period of time, but he still never ceases to seek God's face, to trust God, and to understand that even though the circumstances that he's facing would suggest that God has utterly abandoned him, David in his heart knows that God has not abandoned him, that God is still God, and God's purpose will be fulfilled, and David will be raised up to the kingship of the nation of Israel in God's timing. So David is content to wait on God. And that, I believe, is why David is called a man after God's own heart. Because he never, to my knowledge, in my reading, now something might turn up, but to my reading of the scriptures, I do not see a time where David ever voiced a concern that God had left him, that God was not seeking him. David certainly went into the depths of depression, but even while he was there, you can read those Psalms, David still reached out to God. He never failed to understand that God was God and David was his servant, and God's will would be done. So that is the balance of 1 Samuel. If we want to just run through, and we'll see that there's some interesting stories in there. Chapter 19, of course, Saul tries to kill David. Chapter 20 is when we have that story of Jonathan warning David by shooting the arrows and sending his servant. And then we have in chapter 21, David lies to the priest and convinces the priest to give him the holy bread out of the tabernacle, the bread of the presence, and which eventually causes King Saul to slaughter Ahimelech, who was the priest, and his whole family, because he helped David, even though he thought David was on a mission for the king. And then we have David in the cave in chapter 22, where David could have killed King Saul in the cave. And then we have David with the Philistines pretending to be crazy in chapter 23, chapter 24. David again spares Saul's life. And then in chapter 25, Samuel dies. And then David gets another wife, because part of what Saul does for David is he takes Michal, David's wife, Saul's younger daughter, and gives her to another man as a wife. But then David starts acting like, in chapter 25, we have the story of David and his men acting like a protection racket, like they're the mafia. If you'll read that, the scripture is never shy about admitting when the heroes of the faith fall. And we see in chapter 25, David has been providing protection for the shepherds of a man. What is his name? Is Nadab? What's his name? Nabal. Providing protection for the shepherds of Nabal when they're out in the field. And it was expected that Nabal would reward David and his followers for not stealing the sheep and not allowing anybody else to steal the sheep. Like I said, a protection racket. But Nabal is obstinate and tells David to go blow it out the wazoo. And Abigail saves the situation, who was Nabal's wife. She takes and makes an offering to David and calms David's temper and keeps David from doing something really, really bad that he would have regretted. But then Nabal dies, and David takes Abigail as his wife. So David gets another wife out of that interaction in chapter 25. David spares Saul again in chapter 26. And then David, ultimately in chapter 27, ends up fleeing to the Philistines. Chapter 28, we have Saul consulting the witch of Endor, and God allowing the spirit of Samuel to converse with Saul briefly. And Samuel prophesies to Saul that Saul and his sons will join Samuel in the afterlife very shortly. And then David, the Philistines get tired of David and they kick him out, and David and his wives and everything are captured at Ziklag, the city that David had been given. And so David goes and frees his wives and all his belongings. And then in chapter 31, Saul dies. And then we'll start on 2 Samuel next week, because David is going to be anointed king. And then we'll start talking about the things that happened during King David's kingship, which, as you know or should know, is a precursor, a forerunner, a foreshadowing of the ultimate kingship on David's throne that will be the Messiah during the millennial reign. So that is the balance of 1 Samuel. A lot of interesting stories, but if we go over every one, we'll be doing this for the next decade, I believe. Questions, comments?